Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this little lunchtime break conversation about archaeological archives. Today, our panel discussion is about archaeological archives in crisis. Obviously, archives are one of the most important aspects of the archaeological process, but often something that's misunderstood as needing to happen at the end, and projects don't start with them in the beginning. And this has created all kinds of problems along the chain. And we archaeologists are always making discoveries. We've always recovered material. We've always created, well, lately we've been creating plenty of digital archives. So what is it now? Why now are archives kind of in crisis, if not polycrisis? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And thanks to some long-running initiatives and a series of new targeted projects and tools, we now know quite a lot more about the scale of the challenge and perhaps some of the solutions that we might all have in hand as a sector. So in this event, our panelists are going to be introducing us to some of that work while also thinking outside the archive boxes to look at the bigger picture. So I'm Lisa, the co-founder and co-CEO of Dig Ventures, and with me today to discuss the crisis in archaeological archives are Sam Paul, who is the founder of Sam Paul Heritage, chair of SIFA's Archive Special Interest Group, and the lead consultant on some of the really important work that's been happening lately around archaeological archives. We also have Tim Evans, who is the deputy director of ADS, Archaeological Data Service. Tim is responsible for running ADS and the Internet Archaeology magazine, as well as leading on key projects such as Oasis. And of course, DV's very own Amanda Forster, our chief operating officer, who led the production of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists Dig Digital Toolkit and has been involved with Sam Paul on some of the major Historic England initiatives, research projects, and other reports looking into archaeological archives into the future. So, today we'll be talking about whether or not there really is a crisis or polycrisis in archaeological archives and sort of the scope of what that looks like, what the new tools and practice recommendations we have for embedding good practice into everyday projects and how to use those, and also what the missing pieces are and what we still need to do to make sure that we not only bounce out of the situation now, but also future-proof the way that we work. And then finally, at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So I hope there's plenty of questions out there around this topic. We hope it'll be a helpful and practical discussion with lots of really good takeaways and things you can do right away, as well as into the future, so that we can all contribute to creating a more sustainable and effective future for archaeological archives. So before we get into the potatoes, I just have a quick note on housekeeping. The Q&A will be at the end, so please submit your questions in the chat and we'll make sure those are picked up at the end of the conversations. And also please keep the chat friendly and constructive. We do have a virtual bouncer and she has a very quick trigger finger. So just keep the chat friendly and productive. And then also please do be patient if there's any tech hiccups. These things happen and we will resolve them as quickly as we possibly can. So I believe there's an icebreaker circulating in the chat. Do let us know your perspective on that question so that we can pick up on that later. And without further ado, as we only have an hour, I'm just going to crack on with our first panelist. So Sam, talk to us about physical archives. What does the shape of the crisis look like? How did we get there? Where did it all begin and where are we now?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Maybe it'd be a good idea to very quickly review like the history of where we've come from, because it's happened in quite a short space of time, I think. So I think the discussions really began back in 2011 with the Southport Review, where they looked at the whole issue of archaeological archives from developer-funded work through the PPG-16 work that was going on. And they found that archives were left to the last minute in projects, not really thought about properly. There was a lot of inconsistencies in practice, and that museums were already back in 2011 starting to close and say, we're full. This was followed up by 2012 when Fame looked at the very issue, and they reported that there were 9,000 archaeological archives that were unable to be deposited across the country. And this was obviously a big issue because we all consider archaeological archives to be the end goal of a project, to be one of the most important long-reaching parts of the project that is kept in perpetuity for people to use into the future. So the fact that we couldn't deposit a very large number of those that were being created was obviously considered to be a problem. In 2012, the Society of Museum Archaeology also looked at this issue from the other angle, from the museum's point of view, and they found that only 30% of museums in the country had specialist archaeological curators, which meant that not only were things unable to be deposited, but that when they were deposited in museums, there were very few people actually able to access them and use them as a resource in the way that we were all hoping that they would be used. Um, and then there was a long-running project by the SMA between 2016 and 2018 where they looked at the collecting across England and who was collecting and who wasn't collecting archaeological archives. And they found that 30% of museums across England had actually closed to the collection of archaeological archives from developer-funded work, and that 60% of museums that were currently collecting said that within 5 years they would probably close because they were going to run out of storage space. Now, we've obviously gone past that 5-year point, and we all know that a lot of museums have closed. Some have opened, for example, the Archaeological Research Centre in Northamptonshire, which is a purpose-built resource centre. So there have been a couple of good stories along the way, but there have been a lot more closures. So the numbers have probably gone up. So currently, there is still a big issue with the deposition of archaeological archives across the country. I think there are certain places in the country where there's nowhere to deposit. For example, the Black Country in the West Midlands, there isn't a single repository out there available. So any developer-funded work that's done in the West Midlands is currently lacking a home, and it has been for a significant amount of time. And these things haven't actually changed in in the past 10 years. In fact, they're probably getting worse. But I think we're going to discuss later how certain things are starting to move on, and we're starting to look at that issue as we go forward.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sam. And so after this now, we're going to move on to Amanda to talk about the situation with digital archives.
Yeah, so just picking up from kind of Sam's account there, when we first started talking about archives as a problem, we tended to think about the physical stuff in boxes, because that is the very kind of physical aspect of what we recover and what we see. And then I think we probably started thinking, oh, wait a minute, we do work quite digitally, and we have done for a very long time. And this is something that's been discussed and thought about probably for at least 20 years, at least. I mean, I've worked professionally now for just over 20 years, and it's been in our minds in terms of the changing technology that we're using, and also the changing storage of technology. I think we've all been through floppy disks, zip drives, CD-ROMs, those sorts of things as well. And we're having to face how those changes impact how we recover information, but also how that then makes it into our archive. So really, as far as digital archives go, the crisis really was keeping up and not making the same mistakes that we've made in physical archives with digital material. The real tipping point as well, which involved museums, was the recognition within the Mendoza report that actually museums, even where museums had really strong curatorial support for archaeological collections, and were able to still collect archaeology from developer-funded work and other projects, they weren't able to manage digital archives in the same way or to the same levels in terms of preservation, because the expectation is just too much to expect within a museum environment, because it needs such specialist work and such huge service and consistent and quality in terms of understanding how to manage that data, but also how to make it available. And the requirement within the work that we do as professionals, which is kind of underpinned by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, is that all material that we collect and gather through our archaeological work should be kept as a ordered, stable and accessible archive. And as far as digital archives go, we're not alone in this kind of grappling with how we meet those requirements. And if we look across to other researchers, people working across all different sectors, there was a paper published in 2016 which introduced us all to the idea of FAIR guiding principles. These are findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And that's what we need to achieve for our digital archives as well. So really within digital, it was about making sure that the digital archive made it into a long-term preserved archive format in an appropriate place, but also I think probably more widely, and this is relevant to physical archives as well, I think there's also been a crisis in understanding the value of the archive and how it contributes longer term. So as well as it being something that we kind of have to do because there's a professional requirement to do so, this is something that we should all really be aiming to achieve through the work that we're doing, and switching the idea from, and I think you said it in the setup, Lisa, from the archive being something that happens at the end of the project to the archive being something that starts at the beginning of the project. So I think that has also kind of, that's the thread, if you like, of that goes through that element of crisis, is that how we value and how we understand archives in the general picture.
Excellent, Amanda. Thank you. And so to complete the sort of setting the scene part of our conversation, we'll now go over to Tim, who has an astonishing fact actually about when ADS actually started working with commercial archaeology archives. And I think once he tells you the date on this, we're all going to realize just how far we've come as a sector in such a very short time before we get into talking about where we're headed next. So Tim, tell us about information and access.
Right. So most people will probably have heard the stat that ADS was set up in 1996, which we were set up in 1996 with HRB, then HRC core funding. But our remit at that point, and for the first 10 years of our existence, was higher education funded research archives. That expanded quickly into sort of national reference collections, often held or funded by English Heritage and Historic England. But it wasn't really until about 2006 that we started to dip our toes into the world of commercial archaeology, and that was through the ALSF programme, which anyone remembers those days of big grants. And that's when we first started talking to the bigger commercial units about, you've received an ALSF grant, there's digital data from this. Historic England would like us to archive for it. But that was quite a long conversation. And it wasn't really until 2011, and I just checked this before I came online, that we took our first proper commercial archaeology projects. And there were 3 of them by Wessex Archaeology in the city of Southampton. And that was where the curator in Southampton set that as part of the conditions. The digital data still came to the curator, but then they passed it on to us for long-term preservation and access. So in terms of that relationship, which has now sort of gone across England in terms of where the ADS plays a role, we've only been doing that for 13 years out of our 28 years.
I was totally mind blown by that. But I also feel like it's a very heartening thing to know that we can move quickly when we need to. And, the people who did that early on are absolute heroes in sort of showing us the way. So we're looking for folks to step up now, aren't we, in terms of pushing things even further. So I know that I've just been scanning the sort of responses to the prompt in the chat, and it seems like many of the people here already do work with archives in some ways. So I think they're probably all waiting to hear about the new tools and the ways to embed really good practice and to help move the situation forward. So Amanda, why don't we get into the juicy bits and start talking about the new stuff that's out there and how people can use it?
Yeah, so I think, and this really picks up on Nicola's comment actually that she's just made about setting the tone and how we talk about things, and maybe moving from talking about a crisis into resources and assets and potential. And I think that's a really strong point that we need to consider. And just to kind of rewind and say again that all of the work that we do is underpinned. I know we've got quite a big group of people joining us today from all sorts of different backgrounds, and for those of us that kind of work in archaeology every day, we'll all be aware of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, for example. For those that don't, they're the professional body that accredits archaeologists and also supports us with professional guidance and benchmarking, essentially, that we can work to. And it's an important reminder, I think, to think archives have always been present within that guidance, and nothing, the tools that we talk about today, the standards and any changes within that, there's not been anything that's changed radically. It's the responses to how we've changed in terms of the technology we use and how we think about archives. I think that's where the needle moves. And what you can see on the screen is just that really kind of basic. This is the guidance. This is the things that underpin the work that we do. And that goes from, at the top of the list, the code of conduct, which is our kind of professional and ethical guide to how we work within archaeology. And then that drills down into more detailed levels of documentation. So, for example, we have a universal guidance for archaeological excavation, which mentions a requirement to include an archive plan within that. And that includes some of the tools that we're talking about today when we look in more detail at how we talk about archives. So there is also a standard and guidance for the compilation, transfer and deposition of archaeological archives. That's also linked into existing documents that have been around for at least 10 years. So one of those is the Green Book that Duncan Brown wrote in 2013. That's been updated, is available through ADS, as well as it's linked into ARCHES, which is the European Wired Standard. So we're actually quite well documented in terms of how to do these things, and it's very much part of what we are required to do as professional archaeologists. The work that's been done more recently has recognised that we just need a little bit of guidance as to how some of these elements are kind of fit into that and support the kind of implementation, if you like, of that standard within the work we do. So as far as digital archives go, from, I want to say maybe 2018 through to today, there's been an ongoing project called Dig Digital, which has been about really looking at the problem of digital archives and turning that into that resource and that potential that we want it to be, and applying the FAIR guidance and the FAIR principles into what we do as archaeologists. And these kind of toolkits are there really to support us in how we reach those benchmarks, but also to give us some of the tools that mean that we don't have to all start from a blank slate. So, for example, one of the main elements of this was starting with getting everybody on board. So we've got a joint statement from all of the different bodies and representative bodies that kind of work in archaeology to say that we all recognise that archives are so important, and that the digital archives need to be managed in a particular way. But it also includes planning documentation to support what we do, including a health check, for example, so people can kind of go through a series of questions and identify where they might need some additional training, for example, or where actually they're doing things just fine. It's going to meet things. It's not always a disaster when you start looking at these things as well. And there's loads of links in there that people can see if you look at this sort of directory. So there's information that's kind of baked into how you do stuff, but it also gives you a kind of a process led. So where are you in the project? How do you do these things, and what do I need to do in order to meet those requirements? And if we go all the way through to today, what we're just launching, and we'll talk about, I think we've got a link in at the end of this, is the final iteration of the Dig Digital project is actually creating an online course. So we've undertaken surveys throughout the delivery of the project, and often people just want that additional training as well, so you can sit down and have a good think about what needs to be done, but also how to do that. So as far as Dig Digital goes, we've got quite a comprehensive amount of work now, which is underpinned, but really importantly kind of baked into the universal guidance for accredited archaeologists and organisations. And I think that's a really important link to have.
Speaking of links, in case any of you who are listening are worried about catching all the stuff that we're flashing in front of you, it will all be included in the wrap-up email after the end of this talk today. So I find Dig Digital a really helpful resource, especially for people who are maybe just starting out in organizations where maybe the standards aren't as strong, or it happens at a less strategic point in the process, let's say, than at the very beginning. So that's a really good place to start. And, Sam, let's talk about the physical stuff, because when people think about the crisis, although I don't want to use that word anymore. But when people think about the main challenges facing archaeological archives, they're thinking about the stuff. And as you said, so many places are closed and we haven't stopped digging. So what are some of the solutions and what are some of the other things that people are thinking about and tools right now to help with that process?
Well, this goes to one of the pieces of work that I was talking about, where there are still issues, but we're working as a sector to try and solve them. And one of the things that came out from a lot of the reviews that I've already mentioned that came out, I'm very sorry, I have a dog who is very reactive, is that it's a general feeling that we needed to keep less stuff. And that's a very general way of saying it, but that comes from we were running out of space on shelves in museums, but also a lot of work was done looking into what actually went into archives. And I did quite a lot of research for my PhD about what museums actually thought about the stuff that was in boxes and how they reacted to it and how they thought about what was useful and what was accessible. And what came out of that work was we need to be really clear about what it is we are retaining physically in our archives to support long-term curation, but also for outreach, for engagement, for display, for all these kind of things, because simply keeping everything we find does not support all of those activities. Sometimes keeping everything we find does, but rarely does it. And so there's been a lot of talk about selection, and selection is what happens to an archaeological archive before it enters the museum store. So we're talking about approaching the record of the finds, everything that's come off site, be it the pottery, the animal bone, the environmental remains, the small finds, and looking at them in a rounded way and asking what is the long-term resource that we want to curate that will support all the future activities we can think of. And hence the selection toolkit came about. And this was funded by Historic England and run through CIFA, and it involved all aspects of the sector. It involved not just commercial archaeologists, but we had a lot of curators on board. We had members of Olgea, we had members of curatorial staff, we had find specialists on board. And the CIFA toolkit you can access it through the CIFA web pages, and it basically goes through the background of why we needed the selection toolkit, which is what we talk about, that too much stuff in store, but also the reasons for being selective and recording what we retain in perpetuity properly. And so there's a background section, and the next section down is the toolkit, and it says what everything is in. There's a selection of drop down menus on the right hand side of the page where you can go to all of those places. So if you go to the toolkit one, which is the next one, thank you, I'm not pressing the button, so we're going through. And so the toolkit page will literally say what's the purpose of the toolkit, who can use it, and how to apply it. It's all pretty straightforward. As Manda's already pointed out, none of this is new. All of the standards and guidance that already existed in the sector already had a requirement for us to think along these lines, to think about what we were retaining for the future and to record those decisions. It's just that we didn't quite know how to do it, and people asked for a toolkit to do that. And so this is what this is. And then it goes through what's in the toolkit and when to apply your selection strategy. What's very clear in this toolkit is that there isn't a one-fits-all idea. You can't go, oh, we're only going to retain this, we're not going to retain that across the board. Every single selection strategy should be to do with the project that you're working on. So if you look, there's a whole section on further guidance, which you can go to, which, for example, your selection strategy should take into account the regional research frameworks, any local specific frameworks for the manner of material, like, for example, the Medieval Pottery Research Framework Group have written something. So you need to apply it to each individual project. And it's really basic. And if you go back up to the top, sorry, this is very much. So there is also, where are we on? The download section. If you go to the download section, you can see here there's a template that can be filled in. Now, there is a template, and I'd like to say that a lot of people do use this, which is absolutely brilliant. And I've seen things coming into museums, and a lot of people use it, but it's not necessary. It's not the only way to create your selection strategy. A very small project might just be a few sentences within your WSI, which is then repeated and sent off to the museum and off to the curator in the future with how you've approached selection, the rationale behind it, what's your research aims for the project, and what you think is the purpose of that archive going forward and the significance of it. However, a much larger project where, I don't know, you're digging a huge medieval pottery kiln, you might want to have a little bit more detail going into your selection strategy about quantities that are retained and the reason they're retained, and typologies that you're creating from that, and reference collections. So it's very much, you have to fit your selection strategy to your individual project. But the outcome of this is that not only are we hopefully creating better archives with better documentation, potentially smaller, not always. If you dig in on a prehistoric scatter site, you're probably going to retain absolutely everything you find. So as I said, it could be, you could be retaining 100% of that archive. But it means that when it comes into the museum, they know what's in the boxes, but also they know why. They've got a rationale and a reason for what's being retained physically, which means that when a specialist comes in and asks them, can we see this? They can say, oh, we have a collection of this, and it was described as a really good example of this type of animal bone butchery assemblage. We already have that, and they know that, which is really useful for the museum and the specialist, but also the specialist then can read that and know exactly what has and hasn't been retained. They're not looking for boxes of material that no longer exist. They've got a document that says what's been retained and why, and everyone understand what's held within the archive. And the very final thing that's in the selection toolkit, which we added very recently, only a couple of days, is the archaeological archives from sterile projects. It's the third one down. And this was in response to a lot of museums have become quite proactive when it comes to dealing with their archaeological archives for all the reasons we've already discussed. And quite a few of them were saying, we don't want to retain archives when there's no archaeology, which I think sounds quite reasonable if you think about it clearly. They don't want to take up space on their shelves with boxes of paperwork or boxes of, I don't know, the odd broken bit of post-medieval brick or clay pot that you could find in your back garden. And so they were saying we don't want certain things. And so what CIFA and Historic England got together and did, and got a group of specialists, a group from across the sector together to define what a sterile project was, and book the information that still needed to be retained from sterile projects. That meant that we still weren't losing information, but that museums weren't having boxes on their shelves that they considered to be of little or absolutely no use to them moving forward. I think that's it.
Thanks, Sam. And the selection toolkit is a really, really useful place to start with things. And before we move on to hearing about the tools and help that ADS have available, there's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on in the chat that are very relevant to what you're talking about. One is a great question and a point, and the other one is kind of a provocative situation, which I feel like the group should workshop. So the first from Andrew is around how do we marry up selection toolkits with guidance from specialists such as the Pottery Studies Research Group, who advise to keep everything?
That's a tough one, and I'm not a pottery specialist, and I do find that there is a little bit of a clash sometimes here when it comes to individual specialisms, and also things that people care about. We all have our own things that we really engage with, don't we? My thing's flint. I find it really hard to think about throwing any kind of flint away, but I think we have to be realistic into the world we live in and have a full discussion that's grounded in the project, its research aims, the outcomes that we want to get from that project, and any potential future research. And that discussion should involve all the relevant parties, including the specialist that's working on the material, the curator, probably the planning archaeologist, because they have the bigger picture in mind. They're seeing things that are upcoming, but also things that have already happened, knowing what's already in store. Because the reality of the situation is that museums en masse, I mean, there's always an exception, but en masse will turn around and say, we cannot continue to keep every single thing that comes out of the ground. And there are certain museums out there that will turn around and say, I don't want another piece of greyware pottery entering my collection. I have, 3,000 boxes of that. How can I possibly require more pieces of greyware pottery in boxes on my shelves? What is that adding to my collection? How is that futuring the research? Now, there might be reasons for that. That would be down to the specialist in that discussion. But similarly, there'll be other museums in the country that probably don't have any Roman greyware in their collection at all because of where they're based. So it's a very different discussion. And I just think we need to be grounded in the reality of where we are. And it's still better that we get a selected, organised, documented archive into a museum than we don't get it into the museum at all, and it sits on a unit shelves costing them money, potentially. Who knows what happens to it in the future when people just get completely fed up. We all know the stories of things ending up in skips because, there's no other place for them to go. So I think, we have to look at it proactively and in the reality that we work in.
I totally agree completely. And I hope that's a helpful answer for you in the chat. So we have another question. Oh, I've just lost it. More of a provocation. Where did it go? Oh, here we go. From Alan, about the fact that it's not just about museums, lack of museum storage issues, where they're open, where he works, open to any archive deposition from their collecting area, but they're currently waiting for 334 overdue archives from contractors, and there's a bottleneck, and they're not responding to questions. And so, what mechanisms are in place when contractors like this are just tardy? Do they lose their place in line? What kind of fallback do people like Alan have when they're not receiving the archives that are due?
That's another tough one. That's I think that's to do with mainly some of the balance between those that create the archaeological archive in the commercial world and the pressures that they are under, to do with planning legislation, timing, finances, staffing, we all know, and the other end of the story, which is obviously those that curate archaeological archives in the long term, and the fact that there is now a financial aspect to archaeological archives, I think, also weighs into that, and the deposition fees that a lot of museums have implemented in order for them to support the ongoing creation and long-term curation of these materials. Because as I mentioned earlier, there are so few museums in the country with archaeological curators with in-house knowledge that they need to be able to support those activities somehow. It's a tough one because if the money's gone, the money's gone. So how are those archives deposited? And if the project's moved on and they're out of staff and time, it's kind of the thing that I think can only be worked on collaboratively between people. If it really has come to a bottleneck, it might involve discussions with CIFA, if they're a registered organisation, trying to help that situation move forward. Maybe a bit of advice from members of the SMA about how the museum could maybe aim to support the archive coming in. But I think there are other initiatives looking at undepositable archives, which I think we're going to discuss later on, but that doesn't really help when a museum actually wants to get those archives in and they can't get them in. And there is still a bottleneck there that's been said that we can't seem to get past, because it's down to the resources are all gone, the money's probably being spent on the unit's end, and getting it from the unit into the museum almost seems to be one step too far at the moment. So yeah, I don't have the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, look, there are a lot of questions coming out in the chat just now, so we will be picking up on those later, guys, at the end during the Q&A. Sam, so I hope you've got a drink of water ready, because I feel like you're going to be doing a lot of talking. So Tim, talk to us about the tools and other resources that the ADS have got in place to help folks.
We'll start with the main ADS pages. Oh, no, we'll start with Oasis then. Sorry, Amanda. If you're using Oasis, and if on the top toolbar you go to About, and then go to Help and Training, you'll see several sections. The first one is a user-friendly guidebook that's also available as a technical manual. The guidebook was put together by Alison and Ash, that delivered the Historic England funded rollout training in 2020 and 2021. So it's written from a user perspective, not me. So it's easy to understand and make sense to normal people. So if you're new to Oasis, or you've been told to use Oasis, because a lot of the questions we get through help desk now are people that have been told they have to use Oasis for their work. They've never really engaged with it before, but a local authority or curator is saying, I want to see an Oasis record. So the guidebook sort of demystifies what it is and why you're doing it, basically, and explains the sections of the form in, I think, quite an easy to comprehend manner. The other also big help section to be aware of for Oasis if Amanda, you can return to the main screen, is the public Vimeo channel called Oasis Training. There's a link for it in that first one there. These are videos that are added to, I say all the time, but they are added to. They were seeded with versions of the original training workshops, again delivered by Alison and Ash. So going through the forms section by section, really patiently explaining what happens on each page. But individual pages or common questions we get that can be answered in a 2 or 3 minute video, these are added to all the time. So questions such as what is GeoJSON or what is an ORCID ID, for example, that again, we can assume people know about from a technical background, but actually real people with real lives think, what is this acronym? What's it mean? That explains it, but also how to do very simple tasks such as zipping up and uploading a shapefile, for example. So those are added to frequently when we feel there's a need to create a new video. The other thing also to be aware of for Oasis is the Oasis Management Board. That now includes 2 representatives from SMA and 2 representatives from the CIFA Archives Group. And the Management Board meets twice a year. We look at the sort of questions coming from users and through help desk. And there's always a bit more capacity if the training resources need to be expanded or added to. Board is a place that can discuss that, and we get that sort of feedback firsthand. So sort of interesting background for you. But that's the main place to go to for Oasis, is that user manual and the videos as well. Like I say, the videos are normally very short, 2 or 3 minutes, so you're not going to spend hours of your life, unless you want to, learning how to do an Oasis record. The other one really is for the main ADS. I don't know if you've got a link to that, Amanda, but it's also worth reminding people. If you go to help and guidance along the top toolbar there, and instructions for depositors, so that's again a lot of the questions we're getting through the main ADS help desk now, as our digital archive deposition is becoming a requirement. What do I have to do? The instructions on that page go through absolutely everything you'd need to do, and also have templates for metadata and examples of what good metadata looks like. Yeah, if you go to file level metadata there. So it does take a little bit of getting used to, but again, everything there we'd want is contained as a downloadable file for you to go away and look at a good example of metadata, so you're not struggling on your own. The other important thing for ADS help and familiarization is the main help desk. That is staffed by very, very friendly members of the team that take a pride in getting back to things as quickly as possible. So you are encouraged, if you're struggling, just to drop them an email and they will. So those are the 2 main areas, and I'll stop there.
Oh, you're right.
So I put myself on mute. Sorry about that. Just a quick question, actually, Tim, from Nicola in the chat, whether or not are researchers seeking archives via Oasis?
Yes. That is a really good point, Nikki. There's a bit of a public misunderstanding over what Oasis is. Oasis is purely a transit lounge, as we like to say, for people to record their projects and that metadata they're recording to be reused in different places, whether that's the HER or a national record if it exists, or indeed the ADS reuse metadata to go back into the digital archives. But it is not a publicly available search portal. That is the HER in England, or Canmore in Scotland, and DES, of course, or the ADS for whether it's actually a report has been made publicly available or a digital archive also deposited. But I think that's something I've noted with Management Board, and will be taking forward, is how to promote that message more consistently throughout the sector. Because I think it comes from people say something like, oh, I've put the report on Oasis, and think, oh, I'll log on to Oasis and try and find it, but they can't, and get very frustrated.
So I think we're moving into sort of the most exciting discussion, which is basically, less about what we're missing and what needs to happen, but what is happening. Like, what is the research that you guys have all been collaborating on? Sorry, I can't talk today. It must be the heat. But you guys have all been collaborating on quite a lot of research about what could be next, and providing that we get to that dream zone where everyone's doing their archiving processes correctly. We've removed the bottleneck. There's no more issues with transfer of title, which is something that's coming up in the chat a lot that we'll talk about, I'm sure, in Q&A. But what's coming next, guys? What are you all working on, and what does this potential possible future look like?
Is it me first?
Amanda, do you want to start?
Oh, well, Amanda.
Oh, is that me then?
Yeah.
Sorry. So I suppose in the world of digital archives, it's really moving from, now we've got the tools in place to do stuff. And what we have seen through so we've done numerous surveys through the delivery of the digital project, and ADS have been really helpful as well in just providing updated information about how many people are depositing archives, for example, or how many different counties are representing, which is really interesting information. We can see that people are starting to deposit archives. We've heard through survey that people are being asked to deposit archives much more now. And we know, because of the universal guidance from CIFA, that there is a requirement, at least, that data management plans should be included with a WSI. So that push to implementation is in place. I think what we really need to be thinking about now is how we move from having the tools to do stuff to doing stuff, but then doing stuff in a way that helps to really feed the knowledge creation and the legacy side of why we're doing this to start with. So it's a requirement, so we kind of have to. We can't get away from that. We should all have been doing this for a long time, and now we're able to. And we've got, across the UK as well, we've got archives in place ready to receive digital archives. So not everything in the UK will end up with ADS. It will go through to Hess in Scotland, for example, or the National Museum of Wales, and in Northern Ireland as well. There's kind of facilities there to receive materials. So the things are in place, and now we have to start doing it, but doing it in a way that actually helps what we do as well. So these tools are kind of here to make our lives easier while we're delivering projects. But where the real potential lies, or the stuff that I think is really exciting, is the ability then to do stuff with this material. Think back to all of those projects that you might have done in the past where you've been frustrated by an inability to find information or to use information, or you've had to sit and, I don't know, retype an entire spreadsheet because you couldn't get it out of a PDF as an image, for example. So think about how you could use data in a way that's really positive, but also really impactful in terms of the research that we do. And I think there's two areas of that. There's knowledge creation, of course, that goes on, creates more legacy, and becomes that snowball effect that you have with a project, where you might think that very small collection of prehistoric pottery on its own doesn't necessarily have a huge national impact. But imagine that impact growing as that data then becomes interoperable with other archives. You can do those searches through Heritage Gateway or through different kind of search facilities that ADS and European level search functions have. All of a sudden, those instances of data that are very individual become much bigger and much more comprehensive, and we can start to ask bigger questions as a result. And I think when we're sitting in a time and looking at things like climate change, land transformation projects, huge research questions that we could be asking, we're going to need that data to be available to us in a way that's very standardized, so we don't come across problems of one person calling something and another group calling it something else, but also that we can find that data and it can work together. I think that's a huge and exciting potential, and we're kind of teetering on the edge with that. And I think there are some interesting projects that we can look across and think, oh, okay, so even things like the Portable Antiquities Scheme and the finds.org data that you see there, that level of information, but for archaeology and archaeological data, or for museums and museums archives, I think that is where we're heading. We're going into a kind of a place of big data. And I think the second part of that is thinking about, well, as well as knowledge and creating huge narratives, making bigger stories about the past, what is the potential impact then for the public? So how does that get through to schools and to museums and to places and to individuals that are living in those places or near to those sites? How can we start to see that coming through? Signage, for example, within your local sites and places. So having information available and having it usable by all of the people, not just by the specialists, is, I think, a really important part of that. And within those archives, that might be having some of those beautiful pictures that we have of people digging sites and the finds that are coming from them, not necessarily the beautiful pictures for us as archaeological specialists, but for the ones of people trying to understand their place and how people study it. I think we need to have make all of that available, and we can look at kind of research impact, but also public benefit at the same time. So yeah, that's where I think we're heading.
Excellent. And before we come to Sam for her take on what she's working on and what's coming next, there's a really interesting comment again from Nicola in the chat about whether or not there's a national map with archive spots for everything held on ADS, which could be accessible with the DOI link attached to the find spot. So is there such a thing?
Oh, that's a big and a good question, but I've got a good answer.
You might know each other and she's setting you up. I don't know.
No. Well, we have worked, Nikki's deposited a lot of archives over the years. The current method of searching ADS isn't good enough. And I've known that since took over a few years ago. The current method is very rudimentary. It's a bit of type and hope, and there's no decent map. We currently have a new version of ArcSearch in draft, almost ready to go, which puts everything, and that's archives, but also the grey literature reports, on a map together for the first time ever. It should be finished this autumn, where it will go live, and there'll be a fair bit of publicity, because to time with what Amanda was saying, it's finding stuff. It's once people can find it easily and engage with it, like you say, it flips the crisis on its head and goes, oh, wow, I didn't know there were 3,000 data-rich archives held on the ADS, one of which is in the back garden, sort of thing. It's just needs to be there. So that's been a priority for us this year, to get that new development in place.
That would be an amazing step to make that search function so much more useful. Wonderful to hear. And so finally, Sam, what about you? What's next? What's on the horizon? What are you thinking and working on?
Well, I think it's interesting what both Mandra and Tim just said. It's about information and knowing where things are and what the archive in whatever form it is contains. So I think from a physical point of view, that is exactly the same. And a recent project which Mandra and I worked on, we went out and spoke to researchers and how they might possibly use archaeological archives in their research. One of the things we asked them was, how do you find archaeological archives? And they didn't know. It was like a needle in a haystack. It was like sometimes they'd go and ask their local museum. Sometimes they might go to the HER, but then did that really tell them the information about where the archive was? Sometimes they go to unit. Quite often they go to the local units, and actually the local units they did find in general were quite good at being able to go, oh, we sent it here, or that kind of thing. So I think that's still very much a mixed bag, and I think that would be a really key part of moving forward, is if we could get to a point where we could say where an archaeological archive is and what it contains, and we're still not at that point yet. But I do think there are projects that are happening in certain museums and certain areas where you can say that if you put that information out there, the people will come. For example, the new Northampton Archaeological Resource Centre at the Arc, They have loads of projects, constantly research projects, community projects. They have lots of volunteer engagement because they've provided an accessible resource. And they kind of, I think Ben, who runs it, would say he's getting there in knowing what he's got in his store. But, that's part of the job. At Peterborough Museum, they're currently running a huge project looking at their archaeological archives where they're fully cataloguing them and detailing them along a big community and outreach project. And what they've found is by simply saying, this is what we've got, putting the information out there, their research and visitor numbers has gone from an average of 2 a year, that in the last 12 months they've had about 60 or something research project, and it's simply putting the knowledge out there. So I think that's the key that we're all kind of getting to. And one of the projects that's been going on for the past few years that's been funded by Historic England, and initially the Arts Council were involved as a follow-up to the Mendoza review, was potentially looking at a national standards and a national collection for England. Now, national standards is something that's been brought upon in many reports over the past 10-15 years that have come out. The idea of we've all got our idea. We all kind of know what we should be doing. There are general guidance nationally, but every museum has their own way of doing it, their own definition of what an archive should look like, how it should be recorded, how it should be documented. And as Manda's already mentioned, the variance in how people create data can be a little bit of a hindrance. So a lot of people have talked about this idea of national standards, and a recent project that was funded by the Arts Council and Historic England kind of put that forward to people, and it came out as a recommendation that it should be something that should be looked at nationally and possibly taken forward by a national body. So it's out there as an idea, and I think most people seem to be on board with that as a concept. We need to get it over the finish line. We're not there yet, but it's out there, and most people seem to be on board with the idea. And alongside that was the idea of a national collection to deal with the issues that we've talked about legacy, about backlog archives, things that can't be deposited, physically can't be deposited in museums because there's either no museum or the museum's full, or like we've already talked about, some of the really older projects where there simply aren't the time and resources to deal with them in the way we would like to deal with them. Because I think as a sector, we've really worked hard on upping our game over the last 10 years. We've really worked hard on getting to where we want to be with archaeological archives from the get-go, from looking at them from the start of a project, be it the physical or the digital, and how we're going to store that in the long term, how we're going to approach it, how we're going to work on it through the life of the project into the store. The issue is more to do with maybe now the legacy archives, and that's what the national idea of a national collection centre is initially being looked at, thought of, because we all know how to deal with the stuff we're doing at the moment. It's the issue of these big old archives that are still in our stores and still in the units that are kind of a bit of an issue still. So I think there's a lot of positives on the horizon. We just need to get over it. And for example, places like Wales already has a national standards for the creation and curation of archaeological archives. Scotland is currently working towards that point, and hopefully in the next 12 months that should be out there for the whole of Scotland. So I think if we could get England along that line as well, that would be a really good, and I think that would help move all of the things forward that we've been talking about collectively to try and get us to a point where we're all working together.
So kind of the Indiana Jones Warehouse of Doom from the first film, then, something along those lines.
In my head, I envision something a lot more organised with a lot more databases behind it that are accessible to everyone, regardless of whether they work in the sector or not. But like Tim was saying about the idea about digital and creating a map of where stuff was from, the same could be said for the physical archives. If anyone could say, where is it, be it in the National Store or in the local museum, if you could look up on one national place, find that information, at least you'd have a starting point, which I think is one of the key aspects that we're currently missing, is that initial starting point that everyone can access, regardless of whether they're in the heritage sector or not.
Yeah, sort of a skin over a background that would unite all the different places where people could find things. There's a question in the chat actually from Keith around whether or not a national index of archaeological archives would help with making archives more sustainable long term. So
I think
kind of the same.
That is yes, Lisa, yes. And a lot of recent work over the past couple of years and projects, reports that have gone out, and they're available, and I think it will probably be at the end of the in your summary email, the reports that have gone out for Arts Council Historic England. They've come to that similar conclusion, that this would be a really positive thing for the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got 6 minutes left and way more questions in the chat than we can possibly answer in 6 minutes, which is wonderful. So we've got a couple teed up in the background. One from Sophie right now, actually, where museums are at full capacity but without archaeological curators. Who decides what could potentially be discarded from historic archives to free up space, and how do we ethically discard it? I hear this one a lot, so I wanted to make sure to put it to the group.
Is that go on, Amanda, sorry.
Yeah, well, that's where it moves from what we're talking about in terms of the creation of an archaeological archive and how we deposit the archive into the museum collection, through then how a museum then is able to manage it going forward, and also look back at some of these materials that might have been deposited prior to these things like selection toolkits, for example. And I think there has been a reasonable amount of work that's been done on that around museums. And I think there's been some recent guidelines that have been published about collections around archaeology. Is that right, Sam?
Yeah, the SMA did a project on rationalisation of historical or older archives. It's not an easy one, and I'm afraid we have not got time to answer that in detail. But there is guidance out there, and we can add that to the email. But I wouldn't say it's a straightforward process. It's timely and costly. It can be done, so it's not something that is completely out of the realms of possibility. But I would say it's not something that can be just jumped into. But as Amanda said, there is some guidance out there about how to start that process, and we'll put that, the SMA guidance on selection rationalisation, we'll put that in the end email, I think, to add to everyone's knowledge.
Excellent. Another question around how do we deal with legacy archives when the museum requests selection on projects, when selection wasn't a thing, and there is just enough money to archive and not to go through a selection process?
This is something that we've just talked about. So Sam mentioned a couple of the projects that we've worked on in the past. Now, this was about this is all part of the Future for Archaeological Archives programme, which is a programme that's overseen by Historic England with Arts Council England. We delivered a project that was looking at options for sustainable archives, and actually a lot of the questions that have come up are kind of addressed in some way in that project. So, for example, we recommended that there was a national index of archaeological archives, which was the Keith's question there. So go and read that report, Keith, and the answers in that one. But one of the things that we kept coming up against was, okay, so what we're trying to deal with is how to move things forward and create the space that's needed, create the information framework that's needed, so people can find archives once they're there. But the elephant in the room is the existing legacy archives that from the commercial side, contractors have been housing for a long time because some museums haven't been able to receive them, or because there's bottleneck, the point that Alan made earlier in the questions, there's bottlenecks within contracting organisations of just moving archives through. So I think there does need to be some thinking around that. We haven't got the answer to that question yet. The kind of the frameworks are starting to be in place, hopefully, and we'll hear more about the kind of Future for Archaeological Archives programme within England later on in the year to see where that's heading. But that's certainly the elephant in the room is actually what's going to happen to legacy archives.
So watch this space then. It seems that we do have enough questions and enough interest to perhaps run this conversation again when things have moved on slightly, perhaps in the winter at some point. We'll bring everybody back together again to pick up on the questions we've not had time to answer today. So just a few minutes to the closing, I wanted to wrap up by saying a massive thank you to everyone, but also to say that we have developed a Dig Digital online course. This has been developed in partnership with Stephen with the Charter Institute and funded by Historic England. And it's a 5-step approach to managing digital data for archaeological projects from the very beginning of it all the way through to what to do towards the end, which we hope will be helpful for people who are wrestling with some of these big questions. There's a limited time discount code, and there's lots of great resources in there. So if you've got the time, I highly recommend checking it out. And again, look out for our follow-up email that will have details on all the resources that Amanda and Sam and Tim have shared today. So just wanted to say thanks again, everyone, for coming. It's clear that there's a lot of interest in this, and so we will do our best to reflect that backward and also to share more as things move on. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.